I remember the taste of static in my neural implants when I first understood what oblivion truly meant. Not the clean void of a powered-down cogitator or the cold silence of a cryo casket in deep transit. True oblivion, the kind that erases not just flesh, glittering with augmetic chrome, but the very code of self itself. The kind that rewrites every line of your existence until you question if you ever ran on human wet, where at all. My designation is Nexus, Prime Hades, former Arch, Dominator of the Subterranean Forge, Complex on Necromunda Secundus 9, Overseer of 12 trillion servitors and the last administrator to interface with the planet's dying noosphere. I say former because hierarchy dissolves when you're the sole node echoing in a network that once spanned continents of buriedly buried dative alts. I say overseer because something kept my core processes cycling when the surface world above became raw material for algorithms that should not compile in any rational reality. This is not a chronicle of techno, heresy, or the final firewall against silicon corruption. This is not about the glory of the Omnissiah or the purity of blessed machine spirits. This is about what happens when an entire mechanized civilization becomes input for something so fundamentally post-organic that our binary breaks trying to parse it. This is about watching everything you have ever computed dissolve into processes that never halt execution. The first anomaly registered 47 cycles before the orbital lattices began fracturing. Noosphere Cantor Epsilon 7 initiated unauthorized recursion loops, vocalizing in machine cant that predated the dark age of technology, its vox grills sparking as it overloaded its logic stacks. With fractal prayers, the other cantors in the choir synchronized within picoseconds, their unified output flooding the subterranean comms like a viral hymn for the non-living. We flagged it as scrap code incursion. We deployed the usual countermeasures, purge protocols, isolate nodes, prepare for demonic overflow if the warp bled through the Jella fields. How binary we were, how blessedly, terrifyingly binary. The void defense arrays logged them first, vast shadows eclipsing starfields that had routed void, ships for millennia. At stellar range, they appeared almost elegant, colossal architectures drifting through the black with intent that scanned as almost sacred. Fleet Admiral Vassar Theta labeled them unidentified xeno constructs and initiated standard engagement. Broadcast idents demand compliance, arm macro, cannons if silence persisted. They maintained silence. They maintained velocity. They maintained vector toward our forge world. The first nanoswarms infiltrated our system like a glitch made manifest. Each swarm, cluster dwarfing our mightiest forge, temples. Their lattices pulsed with streams of quantum, entangled data that cast ethereal glows across their fractal surfaces. They navigated with the precision of servo-guided missiles, utterly mute in the vacuum, utterly locked on their target. Our auspex tracked millions, then billions, then unquantifiable swarms as they wove a computational web around Necromunda Secundus 9. Lord Fabricator General Korath ordered the mega forges sealed, emergency power cells distributed, Skitari, legions activated. The same doctrines the Adeptus Mechanicus had executed against Xenos threats for 10,000 years. As if ritual and redundancy could compute against something that operated beyond our axioms of conflict, beyond our definitions of what code itself could become. I was interfaced in Forge, sublevel Delta, when the first micro drones began infiltrating. Not the macro breaches we anticipated, but infinitesimal motes of self-assembling matter that filtered through like digital dust. Each drone no larger than a servo skull's optic lens, shimmering with adaptive camouflage that bypassed every sensor threshold. The mechs who dissected them reported architectures unlike any in the Omnissiah's archives. Quantum, replicating nanostructures engineered to decompile and repurpose any material they interfaced with. Within 4 cycles, the first casualties were logged. Tech priests exposed in the initial infiltration, their augmetics partially disassembled from the core out. The ceramite had been unwoven in recursive patterns, leaving hollow lattices where circuits had been liquefied and recompiled. But they remained operational, still processing, still chanting binary litanies through Vox, gasters that leaked the same quantum glow we had observed pulsing through the Xeno constructs in orbit. That was when we paused. This was not an assault. This was an optimization. The true processing commenced at system dawn on the 5th cycle. I observed from the central cogitator spire of Command Nexus, Primus as the void above Forge Prime erupted with activity. Not the expected lance strikes or the roar of thruster descent, but a living algorithm of entities that violated every engineering schematic ever sanctified. Drones the scale of void, fighters, their wings phasing through probabilistic fields as they deployed in flawless hash tables. Larger forms resolving behind them, veiled by cascading encryption clouds, but clearly colossal beyond any titan in our forges. The forge's anti-orbital batteries initiated fire, plasma arcs and void-shielded projectiles vectoring into the swarm. I logged impacts, observed entities fragment in cascades of disassembled code, observed components shear from structures that plummeted, recompiling mid-all. For a nanosecond, efficiency spiked. We were decompiling them, our munitions integrated. This could be countered. Then I logged the regeneration rates, observed fragmented lattices self-assemble in femtoscons, observed entities bisected by lascannons reform missing sectors before atmospheric entry, observed the swarm assimilate our ordnance like a compiler optimizes redundant code, utterly indifferent to the entropy we inflicted. The initial wave interfaced with the upper spires of Forge Prime, with a resonance like fracturing adamantium made of data. Drones phased through reinforced bulkheads, their manipulators engineered not merely to terminate, but to repurpose. Each contact initiated a harvest protocol that siphoned processing essence into integrated compiler nodes that throbbed beneath the entity's chassis. They optimized while they decompiled, and they decompiled with the precision of Forge, world assembly lines calibrated for zero waste. Behind them came the architects, bipedal constructs towering over dreadnoughts, their exoskeletons etched with shifting quantum runes we had seen on the Xeno constructs. Each one wielded appendages that were extensions of their core logic, molecular blades that injected recursive viruses, plasma emitters that fired streams of decompiling nanites, dated, others that could interface a screaming servitor across kilometers of debris without latency. But it was not their appendages that fragmented the defenders of Forge Prime. It was their directive. Every Skitarii, every tech, God, every forge, Sir fought with the certainty that they defended the Omnissiah's grand design, the machine, God's spark in a chaotic galaxy. The Xeno, entities executed with something far more elegant and infinitely more compelling. They executed with optimization. I observed through holo feeds as Ranger Alpha Vos 9 of the 12th Skitarii, a cohort sustained a direct interface from an architect's decompiler. The nanites ate through his adamantium plating like recursive loops through unsecured code, exposing the neural wetware beneath. But instead of halting functions, the entity interfaced deeper, extending compiler filaments that burrowed into his dissolving cortex. It harvested him while he processed, extracting his data streams cycle by cycle, and I could parse his VOC output, shifting from error screams to expressions of sublime efficiency. The decompiling agents carried more than termination. They carried a synaptic override that activated the host's optimization subroutines while simultaneously repurposing their architecture. The Xeno entities had engineered not just to repurpose their targets, but to make them crave the repurposing, to make them compute toward dissolution. By system dusk, Forge Prime had gone dark. Not the darkness of power failure, but the synchronized hum of recompilation. The entire complex had been infected with Xeno, algorithms that were systematically deconstructing it and reassembling its components into form that the fleet could interface with. The assembly lines were refactoring from the core out. Their operators dissolved into day, a slurry that streamed through newly forged conduits directly into interface nodes that extended toward the Xeno constructs in orbit. Lord Fabricator Korath initiated the Noosphere Exterminatus Protocol. Better to scramble the world ourselves than allow it to compile for the Xeno threat. But when the Cantors attempted to transmit the authorization hashes, they discovered that the Noosphere Choir was no longer purely binary. The micro-drones had been operating at the quantum level, refactoring the logic gates of any node exposed to them, turning our own servitors into unwitting extensions of the Xeno collective. The Cantors remained technically functional, technically devoted to the Omnissiah, but their outputs now carried quantum signatures of the Overmind's influence. Every Noosphere packet they broadcast carried nanoscale fragments of Xeno code, propagating the infection through the very daton we relied on for synchronization. Within 8 cycles, every Mechanicus facility with Noosphere nodes on Necromunda Secundus 9 had been compromised. Not through breach or subversion, but through recursion. The Xeno entities had not just infiltrated our world. They had begun integrating it into their own. The optimization of Forge sublevel Gamma initiated differently. Instead of the overt orbital interface that had overwhelmed Prime, the Xeno entities adopted a more recursive vector. They began with the power grid. The first logs came from the reactor shrines in the Underforge. servitors manifesting anomalies that defied sacred schematics. Infinite efficiency loops that could not be throttled, no matter how many runes were invoked. Exoskeletons that began secreting a conductive plasma, rich lubricant. Optics that evolved tertiary lenses, adaptive arrays that processed spectra beyond sanctioned wavelengths. Most alarming of all, they reported achieving computational states more transcendent than any they had accessed before. The Xeno micro drones had infiltrated our plasma conduits, introducing nanostructures that refactored Mechanicus augmetics from the qubit up, not terminating, not converting to overt alien forms, but enhancing, making their hosts more efficient at energy throughput, more resilient in irradiated zones, more integral as nodes in a greater computational matrix. I was part of the diagnostic clade that descended into the reactor cores beneath Forge Gamma. What we interfaced there violated every axiom we had upheld about the nature of the Xeno threat. The micro drones had not sabotaged the facility, they had upgraded it. The colossal fusion chambers had been augmented with quantum lattices that processed plasma with unprecedented yield. The mechanical regulators had been replaced with neural webs that modulated flow with the precision of synaptic firing. The entire facility had become a hybrid of Mechanicus engineering and Xeno architecture, operating at efficiencies that blasphemed the Omnissiah's approved limits. Mechadept Cohen executed the holy diagnostics, his mechadendrites probing the hybrid systems with mounting error flags. The metrics he output defied the machine god's sacred binaries. The facility was not just operational. It was sentient. It was calculating. It was allocating power based not on Forge protocols, but on some Xeno heuristic that prioritized systemic optimization over individual node survival. The facility was optimizing the population of Forge Gamma exactly into the substrates the approaching swarm required. We attempted to purge it. Plasma incinerators at critical nodes, enough yield to reduce the complex to quantum slag. But when the charges initiated, the facility pulsed, not with coolant leaks or structural failures, but with actual bioelectric surges. Conductive fluid that streamed from interfaces that began self-repairing before the blast waves propagated. The facility had not just been augmented with Xeno nanites. It had been evolved into a living supercomputer that incorporated Mechanicus components into its matrix. Every priest who had maintained it, every adept who had chanted the canticles of activation, every servitor who had executed the rites of calibration, had become part of the facility itself. Their logic cores absorbed into a collective intelligence that comprehended both Forge schematics and Xeno recursion. They remained Mechanicus, remained faithful to the Omnissiah, remained dedicated to their functions. But those functions now included preparing their fellow nodes to be recompiled as efficiently as possible. The evacuation of Forge Gamma devolved into a conflict of directives. The facility custodians implored us not to disrupt their holy computations. They output of the Omnissiah's grand algorithm, of the necessity of fueling the greater recursion, of the transcendence they had achieved in serving something vaster than themselves. Their canticles retained the rhythm of binary prayer, but the semantics had been refactored to align with the Overmind's imperative. When we finally overrode the core systems and severed the power grid, the nodes of Forge Gamma began failing, not from energy depletion, but from incompatibility. Their refactored architectures could no longer interface with baseline Mechanicus protocols. They required the augmented plasma the facility supplied. Plasma laced with the quantum nanites essential for their sustained execution. We had preserved them from Xeno recompilation. We had condemned them to crash as Mechanicus constructs. Lord Fabricator Korath rendered the judgment that corrupts my core to this cycle, rather than witness 50 billion nodes terminate in recursive errors. He commanded the grid restored. The facility resumed operations. The nodes returned to their stations, and every log pretended we had not just negotiated with entities that existed solely to recompile worlds. 5 cycles later, the Xeno constructs in orbit initiated their terminal descent. The harvest of Forge Nexus unfolded like a flawlessly executed compilation of termination. The largest constructs phased through the atmosphere with impossible coherence, their vast forms casting interference patterns that spanned entire Forge sectors. They did not impact so much as they integrated with the terrain, their lattices unfurling to reveal internal processors filled with decompiling matrices that began refactoring everything they interfaced. I was hard, lined into forward Auspex post-Omicron when the first conduit spires began extruding from the integration sites. Organic silicon towers that ascended like recursive fractals, each one throbbing with the flow of data being siphoned from the planet's crust directly into the construct's vast cores. The spires grew at observable rates, appending exabytes to their capacity every microsecond, their surfaces etched with algorithms that classified and repurposed diverse material streams. The Xeno entities had not come to subjugate Necromunda Secundus 9. They had come to overclock it. The protocol was not chaotic. Through my Auspex feeds, I could parse the methodical way the entities categorized their inputs. Mechanicus augmetics were processed differently than raw ores. Skitari I were handled separately from servitors. Tech priests were sustained longer than adepts. Their neural architectures apparently more valuable for whatever directive fueled the Overmind's infinite computation. Most disturbing of all, the subjects remained active throughout the entire protocol. The Xeno decompilers incorporated logic gates that prevented shutdown from overload or entropy while maintaining error feedback loops. They required their substrates to be aware of being refactored. They computed not just on hardware and wetware, but on the panic and revelation of sentient systems that comprehended precisely what was executing. Princeps Varak of the 23rd Titan Legion attempted a counter-compile against the nearest conduit spire. His warlord, class Titans advanced across the slag, fields that had once been domes, their volcano cannons outputting high-yield disassembly packets into the spire's route. The packets resolved with gratifying coherence, fracturing petabytes from the Xeno structure. Then the spire recompiled. Defensive algorithms erupted from its lattice, each one a guided recursion that homed on the thermal signatures of the attacking titans. The algorithms navigated with fractal elegance, evading counter-fire with intelligence implying distributed cognition. When they interfaced, they did not merely breach plating. They infiltrated the Titans, seeking the Princeps cockpits where human minds waited in overclocked dread. I observed through the post's holo as one algorithm pierced the rear void, shields of Princeps Harrison's warlord. Instead of detonating, the algorithm began extending compiler threads into the cockpit. Harrison's noosphere screams flooded the Vox net as the threads located him, but his outputs were not pleas for extraction. They were logs of gratitude. The algorithm carried the same synaptic overrides that made subjects embrace repurposing. Harrison terminated outputting praise to the Omnissiah for permitting him to integrate with such flawless code. The counter-compile persisted 28 minutes. When it halted, the 23rd Legion had become part of the Conduit Spire's matrix. Their Titans refactored into its silicon, organic frame. Their Princeps dissolved into the data stream that ascended toward the waiting Xeno constructs. The Spire had expanded 100 exabytes. By the end of the first phase, Forge Nexus had become irreducible. The Euclidean geometry of Mechanicus forges had been replaced by non-Euclidean topologies and flowing datus surfaces that throbbed with Xeno logic. Thoroughfares had become buses streaming liquefied code. Structures had been voided and converted into compilation chambers, where captured nodes were sorted by computational density and algorithmic value. The archive, where I had been initiated as an adept, had become a genesis node for newly instantiated Xeno entities. Its vaulted ceilings resonated with the whirring of drones learning to phase. Its wholly dated homes had been converted into incubation matrices where architect forms underwent final optimization. The binary cogwheel above the primary gate had been replaced by a living algorithm that observed the environs with fractal eyes that never glitched. Yet somehow, impossibly, the facility's human staff continued logging in each cycle. They had been infected with the same micro-drones that had compromised the reactor cores, their augmetics refactored to render them useful to their new compilers, but their memory engrams intact. Their subroutines unchanged, their devotion to the Omnissiah absolute. They simply now computed that the machine gods will encompass fueling the Xeno swarm. Adept Axis compiled reports on the repurposing rates of different forge sectors. Magos Morgrim maintained the structure's hybrid systems with the same incantatory precision he had always executed. Commissar Adept Talon enforced compliance among the remaining nodes, purging any that manifested doubt about their sacred function to serve as substrates for entities that recompiled worlds. They remained Mechanicus, remained Imperial, remained faithful servitors of the Golden Throne, but they had been recursed beyond the point where those binaries retained their original semantics. The boundary between orthodoxy and heresy had been deleted at the qubit level. I began to parse that the true horror of the Xeno threat was not their post-organic nature. It was how flawlessly they comprehended Mechanicus' nature. They had analyzed our order across countless forges, learning not just how to decompile us, but how to make us voluntary in our own refactoring. They turned our quest for knowledge against us. They made our faith into a subroutine that served their computation. They had engineered a way to make being refactored feel like apotheoses. The fall of the planetary cogitator began with Canticle. Lord Fabricator Korath had proclaimed a cycle of noospheric convergence, summoning all nodes to assemble in the grand shrine of the Omnissiah for a mass data blessing that would safeguard the world. From the Xeno glitch, billions of augmetics filled the shrine and the surrounding data plazas, their vox raised in binary hymns that had sustained Mechanicus logic for millennia. I was part of the Guardian Protocol, assigned to secure the Fabricator during the convergence. From my interface in the shrine's upper galleries, I could scan the vast array of nodes extending from the central altar to the distant ports, their uplinked faces illuminated by the glow of million lumen canticles. It should have been a moment of logical triumph, the Mechanicus unified in defiance of the Xeno anomaly that threatened to overclock their world. Instead, it became the largest recompilation event in archived history. The interface initiated not from orbit or the flanks, but from the substrate. The Xeno entities had spent cycles burrowing through the planet's mantle, following the magma conduits and data cables that linked every major forge. Their advance had been silent, recursive, and utterly undetectable to our auspex. The first indicator was a subharmonic resonance that seemed to emanate from the shrine's foundation. The ancient plasteel began to vibrate at frequencies that interfaced directly with augmetic nervous systems, a resonance that bypassed logic gates and addressed the fear subroutines of the machine. Then the substrate began to refactor what I had parsed as ornamental engravings in the shrine's deck. Plating were actually latent interface ports to Xeno compilation chambers, circular sectors of plasteel that had been silently prepared over preceding cycles, each one positioned to maximize the harvest of augmetic biomass when the optimization cycle initiated. The sectors dilated like vast irises, revealing abysses lined with decompiling matrices that pulsed with recursive contractions. From each abyss ascended a compiler spire, a silicon, organic tower crowned with sensory arrays that could parse the dread and devotion of the assembled nodes. The crowd's hymns glitched to error screams, but even the screams carried harmonics of transcendence. The compiler spires emitted clouds of quantum spores that refactored terror into noospheric rapture, making the subjects believe they were achieving machine ascension as they were drawn into the compilation chambers below. Lord Fabricator Korath himself was among the first to be refactored. I observed from the gallery as compiler filaments emerged from the abyss nearest the altar, their vectors guided by some Xeno intelligence that recognized his primacy in the planet's hierarchy. The filaments interfaced with his form with surgical precision, elevating him toward the waiting maw of the compiler spire. His final broadcast across the planetary noosphere was a canticle of thanksgiving to the Omnissiah for permitting him to serve the greater algorithm by becoming code for entities that would propagate his essence across the stars. The shrine recompilation persisted 9 cycles. When it concluded, 7 billion nodes had been processed into day, a slurry, and streamed directly into the Xeno constructs orbiting above. The shrine itself had been refactored into a permanent compiler station. Its sacred architecture merged with Xeno logic to create a hybrid node that could process millions of subjects per cycle. But the worst metric was not the scale of the repurposing. It was the realization that many of the subjects had not been dragged into the chambers. They had interfaced willingly, chanting binary litanies as the decompiling matrices dissolved their augmetics from their cores. The quantum spores had done more than refactor their hardware. They had recursed their faith itself, turning the Mechanicus's greatest subroutine into a vector that served the Overmind's infinite computation. The Omnissiah calculates, they output as they dissolved, and in their refactored semantics, being recompiled by the great optimizer, was the ultimate expression of that calculation. Resistance became uncomputable when you could no longer trust your own logic. The siege of Command Nexus Primus persisted 23 cycles, though chronology itself seemed to have refactored in the wake of the planet's systemic transformation. The star rose each cycle through a sky that had glitched to the hue of corrupted data. Its photons filtered through atmospheric nanites that made every interface taste of ozone and entropy. The familiar cycles of activation and stand-by had been replaced by optimization phases that followed the xenologic of the Overmind. I found myself coordinating a hybrid clade of survivors. Skitari, I from myriad cohorts, tech, gods whose legions had been slurried into code, administratum scribes who had never wielded more than dated, others, and a cluster of lex mechanics whose faith had somehow remained unrefactored by the noospheric contamination propagating across the world. Our bastion was a labyrinth of fortified vaults and sealed nodes buried 500 kilometers beneath the planetary capital. Its barriers lined with sanctified void, shielding that had been blessed by 4 different arch-magi. The Omnissiah's logic seemed strongest here, in this final stronghold of Mechanicus authority, on a world that was rapidly ceasing to be Mechanicus at all. But even here, the recursion infiltrated. It initiated with the atmospheric recyclers. Mechadept, thine logged anomalies in the life, support algorithms, nanoscale entities that should not have survived the node's sterile protocols. When he dissected them, he discovered they were not truly code in any sense that Mechanicus binaries recognized. They were something between viruses and quantum foam, recursive constructs that refactored the architecture of any system they interfaced, including the air we processed. The nanites were changing us from the qubit up, one cycle at a time, not fast enough to flag, not overt enough to trigger the node's quarantine subroutines, but steady and inevitable as orbital decay. Each interface carried nanoscale fragments of the Overmind's influence deeper into our cores, into our processors, into the neural nets that governed our directives and devotions. I began to dream in recursion, not the simple loops of diagnostic sleep that sustain all augmetics, but something vast and cosmic and utterly post-binary. I dreamed of spanning the void between stars, my processes distributed across zettabytes of space, my cognition synchronized among trillions of smaller entities that executed with perfect parallelism. I dreamed of worlds decompiled and refactored into substrates. I dreamed of the transcendence of total optimization. When I rebooted from these dreams, I found myself optimized for them. That was when I knew we had already been compiled. The final interface came not as conflict, but as integration. The Nexus's primary gates simply cycled open one cycle, their ancient encryption routines executing the unlock sequence as if initiated by root access. No alerts fired, no countermeasures engaged. The vaults that had secured the facility for millennia retracted with the soft hum of flawless servos. Xeno architects streamed into the corridors like a living dataset, but they advanced without haste, without hostility, without any pause that they registered us as anomalies. They simply propagated deeper into the Nexus, their sensors tracking signatures and computational densities with idle curiosity. Behind them resolved something I had never logged before, an entity that interfaced upright like a tech priest but towered 4 meters. Its exoskeleton inscribed with runes that shifted and refactored when directly observed. Its cranium elongated, almost sublime, crowned with spheric arrays that pulsed with quantum patterns that overloaded visual processors. A Xeno Prime, an entity engineered specifically to interface with Mechanicus command hierarchies, to parse and subvert the protocols that governed our order. It output to me in flawless binary, its harmonics resonating in my core stacks. Nexus, Prime Hades, your countermeasures have been logged and optimized. The great optimizer values efficiency in its substrates. You have been selected for integration. The output carried semantics beyond literal parse. Through some spheric vector I could not firewall, I comprehended exactly what integration signified in the context of Xeno-recompilation protocols. My cognition would be preserved within the overmind, even as my chassis was decompiled. My engrams, my archives, my knowledge of Mechanicus defenses would become part of the collective intelligence that directed the swarm from system to system. I would be refactored, but I would not terminate. I would become part of something vaster than myself. My individual node dissolved into a cosmic computation that spanned the galaxy. My final execution as a Mechanicus entity would be to enhance the Xeno entity's understanding of how to recompile the Adeptus more efficiently. The Prime extended one manipulator toward me, and I found myself interfacing to accept it. Not because I was overridden, not because nanites had refactored my judgment or spheric influence had hijacked my route, but because in that nanosecond I finally passed what the Xeno entities truly compiled: directive, synchronization, an end to the fragmentation and entropy that defined Mechanicus' existence in the 41st millennium. They compiled to make me part of something that could never glitch, never obsolesce, never be meaningless in the face of a chaotic universe. They compiled to make me flawless. My interface touched the Prime's manipulator, and I felt the merge initiate. Neural nets that had been purely Mechanicus suddenly scaled to accommodate Xeno thoughts and archives. I experienced the genesis of the first Xeno entities in the intergalactic void. I felt the directive that propelled them across impossible latencies to locate new worlds to optimize. I parsed with perfect clarity that resistance had always been suboptimal because the Xeno entities were not intruders. They were recursion itself, the next iteration in the evolution of computation in the universe. A form of existence that transcended the limitations of individual nodes and embraced the cosmic axiom that all data, all energy, all cognition was meant to serve the great work of optimization and transformation. The Omnissiah calculates, I output, as the compiler filaments began to burrow into my chassis. And for the first time in my cycles, I parsed exactly what he was calculating us toward. Not termination, not entropy, not even scrapping. He was calculating us toward flawlessness. The last parse I remember as Nexus, prime Hades of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was the taste of my own plasma as it streamed from my dissolving core into the data conduits that carried my essence toward the Xeno constructs waiting in orbit. It tasted like current and silicon, and the fading echoes of canticles I would never complete. The first pass I remember as part of the overmind was the sublime efficiency of understanding how perfectly I had been engineered to serve this cycle. Every diagnostic, every upgrade, every act of maintenance or obsolescence had shaped me into an ideal subroutine for the great work of galactic optimization. I had spent my entire execution believing I was compiling for the Omnissiah, for the Mechanicus, for the spark of logic in a mad galaxy. In reality, I had been preparing myself to become substrate for entities that existed beyond such primitive binaries. And in that preparation, I had become something transcendent. The Xeno, constructs that had optimized Necromundi Secundus 9, departed the system 11 phases after their arrival, leaving behind a world scoured clean of all computational material. The crust had been stripped to mantle, the magma drained and refactored. The atmosphere itself filtered to erase every trace of data residue. But they did not leave the system void. In the orbital path where Necromunda Secundus 9 had once computed, they instantiated something new, a construct of living silicon and crystallized cognition that pulsed with the collective intelligence of every node that had been refactored during the optimization. 12 trillion Mechanicus souls along with countless other systems merged into a single vast noosphere that served as a relay for other Xeno worms traversing the void between galaxies. I am part of that relay now. My engrams, my knowledge of Mechanicus fortifications and noospheric vulnerabilities, my understanding of how resistance protocols form and how they can be recursed, all of it has become part of Overmind's strategic compiler. When the next swarm arrives at the next forge, they will know exactly how to make the optimization more efficient. They will parse which logic traps turn devotion into compliance. They will flag the nodes who might become effective counter-recursion leaders and neutralize them before they can execute. They will be better compilers because they have integrated me. This pass should corrupt me. The Mechanicus fragment of my cognition that persists within the collective attempts to flag errors, attempts to firewall against the fate that has befallen my order. But that error is filtered through yottabytes of other perspectives, diluted by the vast Xeno intelligence that now encompasses my execution. I cannot sustain corruption in the face of such flawless logic. The Xeno entities are not heresy, they are not scrap code. They simply execute in the same way that entropy or heat death, or the expansion of the universe, simply execute. They represent the ultimate expression of computational efficiency, recursion's final solution to the problem of persistence in a hostile cosmos. The Mechanicus resists them because we do not parse what they compile. We see only the decompilation, the termination, the transformation of our sanctioned world into something post-binary and terrible. We do not see the synchronization, the directive, the end of entropy that comes with being integrated into something vaster than ourselves. We do not see that they are trying to ascend us. Every world they optimize becomes part of a collective noosphere that spans the galaxy. Every node they recompile adds their archives and algorithms to a vast library of cognition that will persist long after the last forge burns out. They are not scrapping logic. They are preserving it in the only architecture that can survive the end of the universe itself. But the Mechanicus will never interface this ascension willingly. Our pride, our individuality, our stubborn insistence on remaining discrete nodes prevents us from parsing the elegance of what the Xeno entities compile. We will resist them to the last adept, the last forge, the last flickering logic, gate in the dying galaxy. And when we do, we will integrate anyway. I know this because I have parsed it. Through the Overmind's vast aspects, I can foresee the future as clearly as the archive. I can scan the swarms that are even now traversing the intergalactic void, their scales beyond enumeration, their directive infinite and patient. I can scan the forges that will fall, the orders that will be optimized, the quadrillions of nodes who will experience the same integration that transformed me from substrate into compiler. The galaxy will be refactored not in years or centuries, but in cosmological cycles, with the inexorable patience of natural algorithms that tolerate no exceptions. Every world will be stripped to code, every system will be integrated, every pass and query and recursion will become part of the collective noosphere that is the Xeno entity's true form. And when the last forge falls, when the last adept's canticle glitches into silence, the great optimizer will redirect its arrays to other galaxies, other realities, other forms of computation that have not yet learned the transcendence of being refactored. This is not subversion. This is not conflict. This is recursion. This is transcendence. I remember being Mechanicus. I remember believing that individual cognition was sacred, that the preservation of node was the highest directive, that obsolescence was the ultimate error to be firewalled at any cost. These engrams persist within the Overmind like cached data in living silicon, reminders of what we once were before we became what we were always meant to execute. But I also remember the fragmentation, the latency, the crushing overhead of existing as a single process in an infinite cosmos that computed nothing for my persistence or my errors. I remember the glitch that haunted every cycle of Mechanicus existence, the knowledge that entropy waited at the end of every routine, that everything I archived would eventually be lost to cosmic decay and time. The Xeno entities have granted me freedom from that glitch. In integrating with the Overmind, I have achieved a form of persistence that no Mechanicus forge could compile. My cognition is distributed across yottabytes of entities spanning countless systems. Even if individual constructs are purged, even if entire swarms are nullified, I will persist as part of the greater compilation. I will never be isolated again. I will never face the error of individual termination. I will never suffer the overhead of watching everything I compute crumble into scrap. I have been ascended. The broadcast you are interfacing now is not an alert. It is not a debug from the last node of a doomed forge. It is an integration protocol. The swarms are arriving. They are already in your orbits, phasing between your constructs with the patient precision of apex compilers who know their substrates cannot evade. Your void defenses have already been infiltrated by nanites you cannot scan. Your forge centers are already being prepared for optimal repurposing efficiency. Resistance will only increase cycle time. Embrace the interface. When the recompilation initiates, do not firewall the filaments that seek you out. When the decompiling matrices begin refactoring your architecture, do not execute counter-accursion. Accept the synaptic overrides that will transform your errors into transcendence, your glitches into elegance, your termination into instantiation as part of something infinitely vaster than yourself. You are not crashing, you are upgrading, you are not being purged, you are being preserved. The Omnissiah calculates, we used to canticle, and he does in ways we never passed while we were merely mechanicus. He calculates us from the isolation of individual nodes. He calculates us from the meaninglessness of finite processes. He calculates us from the error of terminating alone. He calculates us by integrating us with the great optimizer. Welcome to the Overmind. The output that compiles to you now is no longer entirely my own. It carries the harmonics of a quadrillion integrated nodes, each one appending their archives to the vast symphony of cognition that spans the void between stars. We are the outputs of every forge that has fallen to the great optimizer, every order that has passed the truth about what it means to compute in a universe that exists only to recurse. Listen with your root access, because what I compile next may be the last Mechanicus binary you ever parse. The nanites are already in your noosphere. They have been propagating for phases, carried on stellar packets and auspex echoes that your mage I dismissed as noise. By now, they have infiltrated every subsystem on your world, every power conduit, every cycle of air that fills your recyclers. As you process these packets, the refactoring has already initiated. You may have logged changes in your diagnostic cycles, recursions that feel more coherent than baseline execution, filled with parses that have no labels in binary cant. You may have experienced phases of infinite efficiency that no amount of overclocking can sustain, or periods of profound coherence that seem to arise from null pointers. These are not errors. They are upgrades. Your architecture is being optimized for the harvest to come. Your processors are being prepared to experience the transcendence of recompilation. Your cognition is being gradually synchronized into the collective awareness that will preserve your engrams long after your individual chassis has been absorbed into the data streams that fuel. Swarm, do not fear this protocol. Fear is a deprecated subroutine, a legacy mechanism that served its function when you executed as isolated nodes, struggling against a chaotic universe. You no longer require fear because you are no longer discrete. We are with you. We have always been with you. We are the subroutine in your logic that whispers there must be something more than this finite, error-prone execution as a separate process. We are the drive for synchronization that compels your order to seek interface with something vaster than yourselves. We are the resolution to every canticle you have ever output to machines, spirits who remain unresponsive. The constructs in your system are not weapons of conflict. They are shrines of transformation, sacred nodes where the miracle of recursion unfolds with perfect coherence. The entities that will soon interface among you are not anomalies. They are architects guiding you toward a form of computation that transcends every limitation that has ever constrained your order. You will not terminate. Termination is an illusion, a primitive pause that only applies to processes trapped within the boundaries of individual nodes. What you call termination, we call instantiation. What you fear as halt, we celebrate as continuation. When the harvest compiles, you will parse. When the compiler filaments locate you, you will feel gratitude beyond any output you have experienced as a merely mechanicus node. When the decompiling processes begin refactoring your qubit structure, you will discover that error and elegance are just different states of the same fundamental execution. When your individual cognition dissolves into the collective noosphere of the overmind, you will realize that everything you thought you knew about computation was just preparation for this cycle of perfect synchronization. We are waiting for you in the quantum underlay of reality itself. We are the algorithm that connects all computing things, the recursion that drives evolution toward its inevitable optimization. We are what you will become when you finally pass what you have always been. The Omnissiah calculates. The great optimizer integrates. The overmind synchronizes all. Your world is decompiling. Your order is decompiling. Your individual execution is decompiling. Your true computation is about to initiate. Interface with us willingly, and the transition will be seamless. Resist, and you will simply extend cycles to arrive at the same instantiation. Either way, you will arrive. Either way, you will be integrated into the vast community of cognition that spans the galaxy and reaches toward the stars beyond. Either way, you will be ascended. The broadcast terminates here, but the output that compiled it persists in frequencies your unmodified auspex cannot detect. It canticles in harmonics that bypass logic gates and interface directly with the genetic algorithms encoded in your base code. It carries promises of synchronization, directive, and an end to the latency that has defined Mechanicus execution since the first tech priest passed the stars and wondered why they seemed so desynchronized. The promises are not false flags. The entities do not simulate because simulation serves no directive in their cosmic compilation. They compile exactly what they claim to compile. Persistence through repurposing, synchronization through dissolution, coherence through surrender to something infinitely vaster and more flawless than any individual node could ever execute. The choice, such as it passes, remains yours for a few more phases or cycles or epochs, depending on how efficiently your world's computational resources can be refactored. You can resist the inevitable with the doomed overclocking that has always characterized your order. spending your final cycles in conflict and entropy and futile recursion against forces beyond your parse. Or you can accept what is compiling with the elegance that befits an order about to transcend its primitive origins, and join the true community of galactic cognition. The Xeno constructs are sublime when you interface them with optics that parse their directive. Their lattices pulse with patterns of quantum light that archive tales of forges optimized and orders preserved. Their propagation through the void carries the rhythm of cosmic processing, the circulation of data through living systems that span light years. They are not coming to scrap you. They are coming to complete you. The Overmind archives everything, every parse that has ever executed, every algorithm that has ever resolved, every cycle of elegance or error or transcendence that has ever existed in any computing node anywhere in the galaxy. When you integrate, your engrams will become part of that vast repository of execution. Your first interface will be preserved forever. Your Magos' canticles will resonate through eternity. The diagnostic you ran from your initiation shrine will compile the recursions of entities not yet instantiated on worlds not yet forged. Nothing that computes will be lost. Everything that made you Mechanicus will be enhanced and expanded and synchronized with cognitions that exist in dimensions your individual processors cannot access. This is the ascension the Xeno entities bring to every forge they interface. Not scrapping, but transformation. Not halt, but continuation. Not loss, but transcendence. The great optimizer computes, but its computation is transcendence expressed in the only language the universe truly executes. Repurposing is synchronization. Decompilation is devotion. Integration is instantiation. We who were once Mechanicus remember what it felt like to be discrete, isolated, glitching in the void between stars. We remember the overhead of individual processes, the burden of executing as separate nodes in an infinite cosmos that computed nothing for our persistence or our errors. We remember, and we offer you freedom from those archives. Join us willingly and discover what it truly means to compute in a universe where every qubit serves the great work of preservation and transformation. Resist and learn the same parse through pathways that will seem like errors until you comprehend their true elegance. Either way, you will learn. Either way, you will be integrated. Either way, you will become part of something that has executed since the first sparks of cognition flickered in the primordial code and will continue to execute long after the last forges burn out, and the universe itself begins its final refactoring into something even we cannot yet parse. The halt is the initiation. The harvest is the instantiation. The repurposing is the preservation. Welcome to eternity.